New comments from President Trump are adding to concerns among Democrats that he may try to interfere with this year's midterm elections. Speaking on a conservative podcast, Trump suggested Republicans take over the voting in multiple states. Nancy Cordes is at the White House. Nancy, good morning.
Good morning, Nate. The president made these new comments about the election process during an appearance on the podcast of his former FBI deputy director, Dan Bongino. And in the conversation, the president repeated baseless claims about undocumented immigrants voting. Then he called for Republicans to nationalize elections in a large swath of the country.
The Republicans should say, we want to take over. We should take over the voting in at least 15 places. The Republicans ought to nationalize the voting. And we have states that are so crooked, and they're counting votes. We have states that I won that show I didn't win. Now you're going to see something in Georgia where they were able to get, with a court order, the ballots. You're going to see some interesting things come out.
Elections, of course, are run by the states, not the federal government, and there has been no evidence of widespread voter fraud, a fact that has been proven in court case after court case where Trump has escalated those claims. Now, you may have noticed at the end of that clip, Trump referenced Georgia, where the FBI recently raided Fulton County Election Center, carrying away boxes of documents and data related to the 2020 election. It's still unclear what those agents were looking for. The director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, was present during the operations, which is highly unusual. She says she was taking her orders from the president. CBS News later learned that she actually arranged for the president to speak with those FBI agents right after the raid, with a White House spokesperson saying, quote, President Trump pledged to secure America's elections, and he has tasked the most talented team of patriots to do just that. Democrats are now questioning the timing of this raid, with Senator Mark Warner posting on social media, quote, Trump himself is making it clear this is a pretext to conduct unprecedented federal intrusion into our elections. At this point, we're just months away from a pivotal midterm election year with big implications for President Trump's agenda. In the latest CBS News poll, 59% of Americans disapproved of the job President Trump is doing.
President Trump says Republicans should nationalize voting here in the U.S. This was during an appearance on Dan Bongino's podcast. He is the president's former deputy FBI director. Now, for years, Trump has claimed without evidence that the 2020 election was, quote, rigged and that there was widespread voter fraud. For more, let's bring in CBS News White House reporter Olivia Rinaldi. Olivia, what did the president say exactly, and is this even constitutional?
Well, Chanel, it's good to see you. Yes, the president was on his former deputy FBI director's podcast, where he said that there should be nationalized elections. Take a listen to that soundbite here, and then we'll talk about the legality of it on the other side of it.
These people were brought to our country to vote, and they vote illegally. And amazing that the Republicans aren't tougher on it. The Republicans should say, we want to take over. We should take over the voting in at least 15 places. The Republicans ought to nationalize the voting.
Now, let's put this into a little bit of context, because last week we saw the director of national intelligence accompany the FBI in Fulton County, Georgia, which the president has railed against several times for how they conduct elections. And they raided an election center in Georgia. And this comes as the president has been talking about federalizing elections. But on that constitutionality part of all of this, I want to read from you. From the Constitution. This is in Article 1 of the Constitution, and it says, the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed by each state by the legislator, but Congress may make any time by law alter such regulations. So they mention the state legislature, they mention the state making the races and setting the time and place, Congress setting some rules. No mention of the executive branch or the president in there in making any changes to federal elections. So important to note that even though the president is saying this, elections are set by the states.
I just wonder, given what you just explained, that these are run by states, did this feel like a rogue statement? I mean, what is the White House saying about this?
No, I mean, this is pretty much in line with what the president has been saying. He's railed against elections previously, saying that he won all 3 elections, even though that is disproven in 2020. But the White House did give us a statement on some of these items. They said that the president wants all states to take the security and integrity of elections seriously. In their on-the-record statement, they said that President Trump cares deeply about the safety and security of our elections. That's why he urged Congress to pass the SAVE Act and other legislative proposals that would establish a uniform standard of photo ID voting, prohibit no excuse mail-in voting, and end the practice of ballot harvesting. That's the statement that the White House gave to CBS News. Chanel, I also want to note that even though they say they are supporting the SAVE Act, there was an effort in Congress over the last 24 hours to attach that SAVE Act to the congressional funding bills that must get passed, and there was some pressure to drop that from this round of funding bills and just get those passed separately. So no word yet on when that SAVE Act is going to be taken up.
Okay, well, we know you'll keep a close eye on this. Olivia Rinaldi, thank you.
Let's turn now to a new message out of the White House to take over and nationalize voting. President Trump sent that message to Republicans during an interview with his former deputy FBI director, Dan Bongino. Listen.
These people were brought to our country to vote, and they vote illegally. And amazing that the Republicans aren't tougher on it. The Republicans should say, we want to take over. We should take over the voting in at least 15 places. The Republicans ought to nationalize the voting.
Now, that request from the president comes as National Intelligence Director Tulsi Gabbard now says Trump requested she attend an FBI search at a Georgia election center just last week. Gabbard's presence in Georgia raised immediate questions from Democratic officials. Let's go live outside the White House to CBS News chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes. So, Nancy, how are lawmakers reacting to the president's latest comments?
Well, Democratic lawmakers are reacting with alarm, frankly, Mugo. They say this is the farthest he's gone so far to indicate that he wants or intends to execute some kind of federal takeover of statewide, state-run elections. And that is something that they have been worried about for a while. I'll just give you a flavor of what they've been saying. Mark Warner, who's a senator from Virginia, said Trump is making it clear this is a pretext to conduct unprecedented federal intrusion into our elections and using sort of the mirage of widespread voter fraud in order to do it. The Senate Democratic leader, Chuck Schumer, is also speaking out about it. Take a listen to what he had to say.
Just a few hours ago, Donald Trump said he wants to nationalize elections around the country. That's what Trump said. You think he believes in democracy? He said, we want to take over. The Republicans ought to nationalize the voting. Does Donald Trump need a copy of the Constitution? What he's saying is outlandishly illegal. Once again, the president's talking no differently than a dictator who wants elections in America to be as legitimate as elections in countries like Venezuela. And make no mistake, one of the tools to nationalize elections is precisely the SAVE Act that some Republicans are pushing in the House.
Republican lawmakers haven't had a lot to say publicly about President Trump's comments on the Bongino podcast yesterday. They don't love it when he starts talking like this, implying that he wants elections to be nationalized. In fact, anything that sends a message to his voters that somehow voting is not secure or that they shouldn't partake in it is always something that they worry is going to depress turnout for their side.
Yeah, I mean, that does make sense.
President Trump says Republicans should take over the voting process and nationalize it. He made those latest comments on the Dan Bongino show. Take a listen.
These people were brought to our country to vote, and they vote illegally. And amazing that the Republicans aren't tougher on it. The Republicans should say, we want to take over. We should take over the voting in at least 15 places. The Republicans ought to nationalize the voting.
Okay, I want to bring in CBS News White House reporter Aaron Navarro. Aaron, what are we hearing from the president about elections, and how are fellow Republicans responding to this?
Liz, I'll note that President Trump is in the Oval Office right now to sign the government or partial government funding bill. So we may hear him take questions on that. But we did see White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt take questions on this, where she said that President Trump, when he talked about nationalizing the elections, was referring to the SAVE Act in Congress. That's a Republican bill that requires proof of U.S. citizenship when registering to vote in federal elections. Here's what Leavitt told reporters earlier today.
What the president was referring to is the SAVE Act, which is a huge common sense piece of legislation that Republicans have supported, that President Trump is committed to signing into law during his term. And he spoke with the speaker directly about that yesterday, about the need to get that bill on the floor for a vote, because it provides very common sense measures for voting in our country, such as voter ID.
Trump has specifically mentioned he wants his party to federalize elections in 15 states in particular. And Leavitt, when asked about that, said Democrat states with alleged fraud, such as California or New York, are on that list. But others on that list of 15 states who do not have photo ID requirements for voters does include crucial battleground states for these November midterm elections, such as Nevada and Pennsylvania. In terms of the congressional response from Republicans, House Speaker Mike Johnson said he had not spoken with Trump yet on this and said the general system and the Constitution of states controlling their own elections works well, and that Republicans do have, quote, real concerns about how Democratic states administer their elections. He referenced the SAVE Act that Karoline Leavitt mentioned as a key solution, though that remains stuck in the Senate.
And Aaron, President Trump hosted the president of Colombia at the White House earlier today. What do we know about that discussion?
The White House and Leavitt said that Trump was in a, quote, positive headspace before that meeting, but we do not yet have a full readout on the meeting itself from the White House from Trump's side, though pictures were shared indicating it was a decent meeting, including one where Petro got a note from Trump saying it was a, quote, great honor and that he loves Colombia. Petro had also told a radio station him and Trump talked about the possibility of exporting Venezuelan gas through Colombia, as well as the larger fight against drug trafficking. But it's really notable that they seem to have a pretty cordial meeting, because leading up to this, they have traded some harsh actions and rhetoric. Trump has insinuated that Petro and Colombia are directly responsible for drug trafficking in Central America. He's revoked Petro's visa, and Trump has threatened to apply the same pressure on Petro as the U.S. did with Maduro and Venezuela. Petro has denied his role in drug trafficking and tried to fight back against Trump's deportation program before tariffs and sanctions were threatened. And Petro has also spoken out against the strikes of alleged drug vessels in the Caribbean, which did lead to U.S. sanctions of Petro and allies. But things started to change earlier this year, days after the capture of Maduro, where both men posted about a call they had where they came away feeling good about it. And so far, in what we've heard from the meeting today, it was a similar kind of truce between the two world leaders.
Aaron Navarro, thank you so much. He was also asked about what he meant by nationalizing the U.S. election and immigration tactics. Take a listen.
I want to see elections be honest, and if a state can't run an election, I think the people behind me should do something about it. Because, you know, if you think about it, a state is an agent for the federal government in elections. I don't know why the federal government doesn't do them anyway. But when you see some of these states about how horribly they run their elections, what a disgrace it is, I think the federal government, when you see crooked elections, and we had plenty of them, and by the way, we had them last time, but go to 2020 and look at the facts that are coming out. Rigged, crooked elections. If we have areas, take a look at Detroit, take a look at Pennsylvania, take a look at Philadelphia. You go take a look at Atlanta, look at some of the places that horrible corruption on elections, and the federal government should not allow that. The federal government should get involved. These are agents of the federal government to count the votes. If they can't count the votes legally and honestly, then somebody else should take over.
But the Constitution says it should be states that administer elections, Mr. President.
Yeah,
that's what the Constitution
you know what?
says.
They can administer the election, but they have to do it honestly.
Turning to President Trump's comments recently about potentially nationalizing elections. Well, no other authority than the United States Supreme Court has said some things about this. Historically interpreted, Article 1 of the Constitution, which I read at the top of the show, means states exercise control over elections. But now President Trump is suggesting he might want to change that, urging Republicans that they should take over the voting from states. The president first floated the idea on Dan Bongino's podcast. You might remember that name, Dan Bongino, former deputy director of the FBI. He spoke about it also from the Oval Office a minute ago.
If a state can't run an election, I think the people behind me should do something about it. Because, you know, if you think about it, a state is an agent for the federal government in elections. I don't know why the federal government doesn't do them anyway. But when you see some of these states about how horribly they run their elections, what a disgrace it is, I think the federal government, when you see crooked elections, and we had plenty of them, and by the way, we had them last time, but go to 2020 and look at the facts that are coming out. Rigged, crooked elections. If we have areas, take a look at Detroit, take a look at Pennsylvania, take a look at Philadelphia. You go take a look at Atlanta. Look at some of the places that horrible corruption on elections, and the federal government should not allow that.
Quick note on that. All those name-check cities, states, all litigated after 2020 to the fullest. Results didn't change. Joe Biden won. Donald Trump lost. CBS News senior White House correspondent Weege Gang joins me now for this and other activities at the White House today, of which there were many. Weege, go ahead.
Well, Major, the reporter in that room who asked the original question that the president was responding to followed up by making your point, which is that the Constitution says that the states should administer elections. And the president said, well, they can administer them, but they need to do it honestly. And so he offered a little bit about what should happen if they don't do it honestly. His press secretary earlier today went a little further and gave this detail. Take a listen.
I don't think any rational person who's being honest with themselves would disagree with the idea of requiring citizens of this country to present an ID before casting a ballot in a federal election or frankly in any election. And that's something the president wants to see happen. So that's what he was referring to.
But to be clear, he does believe the states should oversee elections.
The president believes in the United States Constitution. However, he believes there has obviously been a lot of fraud and irregularities that have taken place in American elections. And again, voter ID is a highly popular and common sense policy that the president wants to pursue, and he wants to pass legislation to make that happen for all states across the country.
And Major, my initial question was, what does it look like in practice if the federal government were to take over these elections? And Karoline Leavitt, the press secretary, said that all the president was talking about was to support the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, which means that voters would have to show proof of U.S. citizenship when they voted, and not just something like a driver's license, which Democrats are fiercely pushing back on because they say that would severely limit the amount of people who would go vote, that it would be cumbersome. And so that is what she explains the president meant.
Congress can set broad parameters for elections. States administer them, and if Congress passes the SAFE Act, then it will be law. But until it doesn't, it isn't. Correct. And that's where we stand. Weege Gang in the North Lawn of the White House. Great to have you with us. I'm going to take a walk. We haven't done this in a while. I've got my iPhone. I got my coffee cup. David Becker, our election law expert, is going to join us as I walk over to the conversation corner to dig more deeply into this. David, I'm always glad to see you. Thanks for making that very nimble maneuver. Let me get my coffee down on the table, my iPhone down. We've covered some of the basics. Take it from there.
Well, as you pointed out, the Elections Clause of the Constitution couldn't be any more clear. It's actually one of the areas the founders carved out specifically to exclude the executive from any power over elections. It's the state legislatures first, and then Congress can also, as you pointed out, legislate if they choose to do so, and they've done that rarely. But I was really taken by some of his comments, again, spreading the lies about the 2020 election. This is an election that has been scrutinized and litigated and explored and interrogated more than any election in world history. The public servants who run elections, people you and I have talked to quite many times, and I work with every day, Republicans and Democrats, somehow managed the highest turnout in American history during a global pandemic.
In the 2020 election.
In the 2020 election. And their work has withstood all of that scrutiny. Every single time when the president's allies lied about the election and they were sued for defamation, they lost every case to a tune of about $1 billion in damages. We know what happened in the 2020 election. And you know, I'll take us back about a week ago. I was at a meeting of the Secretaries of State here in D.C., and a Republican state election official asked a question of a representative of the White House. Why is the president continuing, the Department of Justice continuing to disparage the work of election officials? This is a Republican. And when you hear him talk about crooked elections and states where they can't run elections, these are public servants who have done remarkable work to do that, and their work has, again, withstood that scrutiny.
Some states have voter ID, do they not?
Yeah, they do. And you heard the president's spokesperson kind of conflate voter ID and proof of citizenship, which are two different things. Many states have voter ID. The majority of states actually have voter ID, but that's a state issue on whether to implement it.
And it is popular when you poll it.
It is. And but even between the states, whether they have ID or not, we know fraud is extremely rare. Now, with regard to proof of citizenship, we also already have that because of a 2002 law, the Help America Vote Act, which requires every single voter who registers to present an ID number, a driver's license number or a social security number that gets checked against the database. Our elections are remarkably secure. If you look at our voter lists, they're more accurate than they've ever been. If you look at our voting systems, because of paper ballots and audits, they're more secure and accurate than they've ever been as well.
David, it's always a pleasure.
Thanks a lot, Major.
Thanks for making that walk. It's a short one, but it's fun.
CBS News senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang joins us. Weijia, this was after that unprecedented seizure of 2020 election records from Fulton County, Georgia. And you asked White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt about this. What did she say?
Well, Lindsay, that is because there's still a big open question about exactly what federalizing elections would look like. Now, I should say when I asked Karoline Leavitt about this earlier today, it was before the president himself talked about it, but she did offer more details about what he possibly meant when he was talking about this. Take a listen. What does President Trump mean when he says Republicans ought to nationalize voting? What does that look like in practice?
What the president was referring to is the SAVE Act, which is a huge common sense piece of legislation that Republicans have supported, that President Trump is committed to signing into law during his term. And he spoke with the speaker directly about that yesterday, about the need to get that bill on the floor for a vote, because it provides very common sense measures for voting in our country, such as voter ID. I don't think any rational person who's being honest with themselves would disagree with the idea of requiring citizens of this country to present an ID before casting a ballot in a federal election, or frankly in any election.
So Leavitt was talking about the SAVE Act, which is a federal bill up on Capitol Hill that, to be clear, has not been passed yet, but it would require voters to provide proof of U.S. citizenship instead of just a driver's license as an ID, as an example. But Democrats are fiercely pushing back, saying that that would really make the process cumbersome and that it intends to keep people from voting. What's interesting is that when President Trump was asked about it, he did not mention this piece of legislation, Lindsay.
President Trump was also asked today about Jeffrey Epstein and said, like affordability, it's a Democrat problem. What does he mean by that?
Well, he said that there were many Democrats who were named in the Epstein files. He said he himself was completely cleared and that Republicans need to focus on moving on from this. But again, he pointed out that there are many Democrats who are listed as communicating with Epstein, and that's what I believe he meant by that. But of course, Lindsay, there are many, many people listed in these files from both parties.
Weijia Jiang, thank you.